Okay, thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr, prynawn da. Good afternoon. I want to start by saying thank you very much to the organisers for this event, really. It's really, I think it's really timely, and I think lots of interesting things, and I hope that my own contribution is helpful. I am going to talk about online learning, despite the picture that you see before you, and I thought it was still useful to have a kind of throwback of what things used to be like, although everything seems a little bit of a distant memory at the moment. So my talk itself, I want to start with a little bit of context. My experience in terms of online teaching is restricted to post-lockdown. So prior to lockdown, I had no experience in online teaching whatsoever. So my discussions today are going to be based on two lecture courses or two modules that I run for just under half a semester since lockdown. Predominantly, I'm going to focus on what I refer to as a standard lecture-based module. The other module that I am involved in is a very different model. I think the ideas I'm going to talk about will kind of resonate in those areas, but I'm predominantly thinking of the kind of standard lecture-based module through these discussions at least. And that's for a year 2, level 5 undergraduate mathematics module with 173 students registered. I'm going to focus on the ideas rather than the technology, but just to note that we use Blackboard at our institution. So in terms of what I used, it was the Blackboard learning system and Blackboard Collaborate within that. Okay. And finally, what I've tried to do is use the well-known primary model of reflection, and that's 2 stars and a wish. So in other words, 2 things that I think I've learned during this process, and 1 idea which definitely needs further work. So the first star, the first thing that I'd like to highlight is structure. And so if you like, part of the scaffolding to support the students' learning. Now, what became apparent as we moved to remote learning is that it was natural to remind students, if you like, of what was coming up, certainly more than what I would have done for typical kind of lectures. So typically on a weekly basis, maybe reminding students about sessions that were happening and also highlighting resources, additional resources that were made available. Now, for 2 things here, obviously people's routines were all over the place. And I know mine are and still are. So it was certainly helping me highlight those things, but also for the students. And I think there was a sense of anxiety that, or the perception of removing something by not having face-to-face, despite the contact sessions or the virtual contact sessions happening. Having additional resources was in some way to kind of highlight or to alleviate some of that anxiety, perhaps. But what I realized when looking back at this, 1, students certainly appreciated it. Simple comments from students about the reminders being helpful and pointing to the resources being particularly helpful. So it made me think that this is something I'd like to adapt. So what am I looking to do in the future? And I'd like to really extend this to highlight the kind of expectations involved around the learning, to try and engage students and help students understand what the requirements are before a contact session, during, and potentially after. So something like this is what I'm planning on kind of extending to as we look forward to next semester. It may change the word essentially, as well as thinking about what activities take place, trying to highlight the structure that's involved, the time commitment that is involved for each of the different learning activities, and being realistic around that. So for example, highlighting, okay, before a session, you need to be thinking about doing this, and this is how long it should take you. and then highlighting what perhaps will happen during a session, what kind of activities will take place. I think we spent more and more time over the last few years highlighting expectations. And I see this perhaps as a bit of an opportunity to really underpin some of that. The other thing that I recognize through this is that the way in which the Learning Central module that I have Blackboard, sorry, is structured is quite disjoint. So it would have, for example, notes in one area, exercises in another area, additional resources, if you want to call it that, in another area. And what this is looking to do perhaps is to integrate those better so that students can see what is relevant according to different topics within the module. And I think this is helping with that particular structure. My second idea, if you like, was I've called reuse, not replicate, and I've thought about this quite a bit. So what essentially do I mean? I mean, it's an opportunity to really think about what we're trying to do or trying to achieve from particular learning activities, not simply replicating that activity. So I'll come back to the lecture recordings in a second. But what I did during the contact session, the virtual contact sessions, was somewhat reflective of what I would do in a lecture. I would suggest my lecture style isn't completely traditional. It's not flipped learning. I'd say it's tilted, somewhere in between. So part of what I did using Blackboard Collaborate would be to annotate some existing slides and to obviously comment on them. Now, I found that as I improved with that, simply just writing on a tablet and highlighting what area that I was talking about improved, I still felt it was lacking in some way. There was certainly a broader engagement using the chat, so a broader students' engagement with asking some questions, but still not huge. So it started making me think about, well, what is it I really want to get from that? In a lecture, I wouldn't spend 50 minutes doing that. But I still perhaps felt that those sessions online weren't as engaging and perhaps were longer or were taking longer than I would typically do in a lecture. So it made me think about how to use recordings. And what I intend to do is to really focus some of those key ideas, those ideas of introducing particular topics, perhaps highlighting some key things, and then trying to utilize the contact time to actually focus on review and doing more. So it's reusing those ideas, not necessarily replicating them. So that made me think about the lecture recordings. Now, when we went to remote learning, I made available all the lecture recordings from the previous year, which were on the topics, obviously, that wouldn't be done in the same way this academic year. And I decided to have a look at engagement with that. And the top graph is last academic year for the same module, and the bottom graph is this academic year. Despite the change in scale, there is virtually identical kind of engagement in terms of download and time spent on the videos, with the natural peak a couple of days before the exam. I was certainly expecting the material after we went into lockdown to be viewed more at that point. And in fact, looking at those specific classes, they are amongst the lowest viewed recordings this academic year. So again, I think there's something there that there is some engagement, as you can see from the usage, even though that hasn't particularly changed from one year to the next. So there is use to these things, but how they are being used, I think, needs to be more focused. So that's, again, where I'm looking perhaps to redo some of the videos and also think about then using the virtual contact time accordingly to kind of reflect on some of that. The one area that did work particularly well, I felt, which is peer instruction. Now, this is something that I have been doing previously, and I felt it certainly worked using in the online environment really well. So the opportunity to ask relatively straightforward questions. I'm a fan of true or false because it gets students thinking. It's based on the idea from primary, if you like, of think, pair, share. You can ask students to do things individually. You can ask them to vote, which can be set up really easy using a simple poll in seconds in Collaborate. You can send students into breakout rooms to discuss those ideas and then come back and vote again. And the level of feedback it provides you as an educator as well as the students, I think is invaluable. So this is certainly something that I would recommend people to think about and how to utilize it, not to overdo it, but to think about how such questions can be used to stimulate some of that discussion, because that's the thing that I was really trying to do in the kind of face-to-face contact as well. My wish, on the other hand, is how to kind of extend that discussion beyond the contact. I did use the discussion board. I encourage use of the discussion board in learning in Blackboard. I created threads according to different topics. I tried to instigate some discussion. I used student emails where they were asking questions as the basis of some of that, and got virtually no response. So I'm really interested over the next couple of days to see if anyone has any ideas around kind of developing this. So I actually returned to simply replying to the student emails. Now, the big change that I noticed in this case was that a number of students, not all, there were still some students sending relatively low-level queries through via email, but a number of students were sending me work that they had completed. So pictures and then sending it through saying, could you comment on what I've done here? Now that for me is engagement. That for me is demonstrating the students have tried something. And that's the thing that I'd really like to capture. So how to get students perhaps to review each other's material, feel free to share each other's material in the first place, and perhaps to comment and critique each other's. That's something that I'd like to do more of, and I'd be particularly interested in hearing other people's views on. Now, we were asked to kind of think about a kind of a take home, and as part of my own learning, I signed up to a Future Learn program about how to teach online, which I think was very helpful. And there was one item that resonated quite strongly with me quite early on in that I wanted to share. And this idea that it's not our responsibility to try and fix everything as we move or as we are kind of looking to work within this slightly different environment. We do have a responsibility to kind of design and to consider how we can support our students as effectively as we can. But there were issues, in my opinion, with engagement previously in the standard approach. And I don't think we're going to address all of those things now. Students have a responsibility to develop that engagement as well, as do we in trying to encourage it. So I've highlighted a couple of other resources there that perhaps people might find useful. And I will stop there. So hopefully I'm on time.
Sorry, I just needed to unmute my audio there. Well, thank you very much. I believe we can still do reactions to this. I think people can still clap on this. I can't see it on my thing, but I don't know. Anyway, we can still go like that. Thank you very much. Right, okay. during your talk, I had to ensure some technical details, so I missed part of it. So if I ask any questions which you've already answered, then my apologies. So there was one which I thought was quite interesting. So I'll anonymous attendee. You seem to be assuming that all students are operating in the same time zone and therefore can respond live to quizzes. However, on account of the pandemic, this is not a given for the new academic year. Any suggestions?
That is a very good point. Predominantly, our own cohort is relatively uniform. We don't have huge amounts of international students, first of all. However, in this scenario, or coming scenario, we are going to have to think about that. And all the sessions will themselves be recorded anyway. And what I was trying to think of, and timetabling could alleviate some of these. And whatever plan we have will have to be linked, obviously, to timetables and everything else. But the ideas themselves and the structure behind the sessions themselves, I would hope could still allow for some students, with whatever time zone they're in, to support their self-directed learning as well. So it doesn't address people from all corners of the globe. I appreciate that. So we do have to think about what kind of timing and what might be possible. How else we do it, I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, thanks. We'll try this one. Sarah and Giuseppe saying, "Hi Robert, thanks for sharing. I'm keen to hear how you gave," and how is capitalized, "I'm keen to hear how you gave feedback to students during online sessions." Can you perhaps say something on that in a couple of minutes or within a minute or so?
So first of all, one thing I did was to ask students to send me questions in advance. So I was able to highlight certain topics, for example. I could, where necessary, talk about quite specific problems, specific exercises. So that could be going through part of an exercise, for example, and doing that live. So that was one way that that was done. Because students were sending me their individual attempts at problems as well, I could provide specific commentary to that individual student. But what I was also doing is using those as a basis for also providing some more general feedback in the contact sessions themselves. So there was a mix, if you like, between myself actually going through some examples live, if you like, although my writing on a tablet was still needs some work, I think it's fair to say. In addition to, like I said, being able to highlight some general points from the kinds of queries that what I was getting individually.
Right, okay, thanks. On that last bit, maybe we've got a minute or so. So Gemma Shipton says, "Hi, thanks for a great talk. I'd like to ask if you think that the efforts you went to encourage online discussion were useful to students, even though they didn't engage. Maybe they were reading but not responding." I mean, that's something we worry about. What are your thoughts on that in maybe under a minute?
I had thought about that actually, because one thing that is difficult to know is if they are reading it. With the discussion board I was using, at least, it doesn't record to say who's viewed it very well. So that is something that could happen. I would still like to encourage further direct engagement from the students, so that again, how to get the norm being it's not all my responsibility to provide the feedback. I certainly have a responsibility. I'm not questioning that, but I think there are huge benefits to the students actually reviewing each other's ideas and then questioning them as well. And I'm still not sure how to really capture that. But that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't some benefit to them actually seeing my responses to the questions.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for your talk. I don't know if people can applaud. I should have checked this beforehand, but there might still be the button on the webinar version. Oh, somebody, maybe they are. Right. So, thank you very much. Now, next up, we're going to move swiftly along here.